I thought I was walking into my own birthday party. I had no idea I was walking into an ambush that had been planned for months. Dressed in silk tablecloths, surrounded by people who smiled at me while holding knives behind their backs. That evening, my mother-in-law Eleanor raised her champagne glass in front of 42 guests, looked directly into my eyes, and said, clearly and without hesitation, "I'm ashamed we have a daughter-in-law like this in our family." The room went absolutely still. I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass. I could hear my own heartbeat. And then I stood up, smoothed my dress, and said one sentence. And after that, the celebration was over. Not for me, for them. But let me take you back, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. And the beginning, as it so often is, looked perfectly ordinary. My name is Clara. I turned 30 that October on a Tuesday, which felt appropriately unglamorous. 30s don't announce themselves with fireworks. They arrive quietly, like a bill in the mail. I had been married to Daniel for 4 years. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a creaky elevator and a super named Pete, who always smelled faintly of motor oil and had a rescue dog named Biscuit. It was not a glamorous life. It was a real one, and I loved it. I had built that life with my own hands, or more precisely, with 7 years of early mornings, missed vacations, and a particular talent for reading financial spreadsheets the way other people read novels. I was a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm called Hartwell & Associates, and 3 months before my 30th birthday, I had been promoted to Director of Client Strategy. The title came with a salary increase that made my eyes water when I saw it on paper. It came with a corner office on the 14th floor that had a window facing east, and on clear mornings, the light came in at an angle that turned everything gold for about 20 minutes. I used to sit there with my coffee and feel, for those 20 minutes, completely and perfectly content. Daniel had been there when I got the call. We were in the kitchen. I was making pasta. He was reading something on his phone. And when I hung up and told him, he lifted me off the ground and spun me around so hard I knocked the colander off the counter. He was laughing. I was crying. It was one of those moments you try to memorize, to preserve in amber, because you know even while it's happening that it's the kind of thing you'll want to return to someday. We went out to dinner that night, a restaurant we couldn't really afford, and we split a bottle of wine and talked about the future until the staff started stacking chairs around us. He was a good man, Daniel. I want to be precise about that, because what came later is complicated, and I don't want to flatten him into a simple villain. He was warm, funny, genuinely kind to strangers, the sort of person who remembered the names of waiters and asked follow-up questions. He was also, I came to understand, deeply and perhaps irreparably afraid of his mother. Not in the way that children are sometimes briefly afraid, but in the way that certain people are afraid of weather, as if she were a force of nature rather than a person, as if her displeasure was something that simply happened to you, the way flooding happens, and the only rational response was to wait it out and repair what you could afterward. Eleanor, my mother-in-law. I should describe her properly because she deserves a proper description. She was 63, impeccably dressed, with the kind of posture that suggested either excellent genes or a strict boarding school. She wore her silver hair in a precise chignon that never seemed to shift, and her perfume, a heavy floral that I can only describe as expensive and territorial, arrived in a room about 4 seconds before she did. She had opinions about everything: the thread count of sheets, the correct way to fold napkins, the appropriate age at which a woman should stop wearing certain colors. She expressed these opinions as facts, the way a doctor might state a diagnosis, and she seemed genuinely puzzled when people took offense. From the beginning, she had been what I privately called manageable. Difficult in the specific, polished way of women who have spent decades perfecting the art of criticism dressed as concern. She once told me at Sunday dinner during our first year of marriage that my risotto was ambitious for someone still learning. She said it with a warm smile, touching my arm. Daniel laughed nervously. I smiled back and refilled her wine. I was 26. I was still operating under the assumption that effort and goodwill could smooth most surfaces. I maintained that assumption for 4 years. 4 years of Sunday dinners where I arrived with wine and left with a headache. 4 years of comments about our apartment. Cozy, but you'll want more space eventually. About my work schedule. Daniel must miss you with those hours. About our decision not to have children yet. Of course, you know best, though the window isn't infinite. 4 years of watching Daniel become slightly smaller every time we walked through his mother's door, like a plant moved from a bright room to a dim one, still alive, still green, but visibly diminished. The party was her idea. That is the part I want you to hold on to. She suggested it. It was mid-September, 6 weeks before my birthday, and we were at her house for what she called a family lunch, which was really an occasion for her to monitor us at close range. She had made her lamb with rosemary, which was genuinely excellent. I will give her that. And we were sitting at her long oak table with Daniel's sister Pam and Pam's husband Greg, who was a quiet man with a gift for becoming invisible in social situations. Pam was 29, pretty in a tired sort of way, and she had always been slightly cool toward me without ever being overtly rude. I attributed this to the fact that she and Daniel had been very close growing up, and my arrival had perhaps felt like a displacement of some kind. It was over dessert, a lemon tart that was more impressive than enjoyable, that Eleanor put her hands flat on the table and said, "Clara, I want to do something special for your 30th. She said it with the particular warmth she reserved for announcements she had already decided upon. I want to host a proper dinner, 40 people, maybe more, the family, our friends, some of your colleagues, a real celebration." I felt Daniel look at me from across the table. I felt the particular quality of that look, hopeful, slightly tense, asking me silently to be gracious. And I was. I thanked her. I said it was generous. I said I'd love that. I meant it, more or less, or rather, I wanted to mean it. I was trying to mean it. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the planning with an energy that I found both touching and faintly alarming. She called me twice a week with updates, the caterer, the flowers, the guest list. She asked me questions about my preferences, the color scheme, the music, whether I wanted a formal sit-down dinner or something more relaxed, and she nodded attentively at my answers. Later, I would understand that she was not incorporating my preferences. She was cataloging them, identifying which ones she intended to override and which were too small to bother with. The flowers were her choice, white orchids in tall vases, which are beautiful but cold, like a hotel lobby. The music was a string quartet playing standards from the 40s, which Daniel and I both found slightly stuffy, but which Eleanor considered the gold standard of celebratory elegance. The venue was the private dining room of a restaurant called Meridian, a place I had been to once before for a client event, and which I associated with the kind of wealth that announces itself quietly, in the quality of the glassware and the unhurried pace of the service. I told my best friend Sophie about it over coffee one afternoon, 3 weeks before the party. Sophie had known me since graduate school, through 2 apartments, 1 bad relationship before Daniel, and the slow, patient work of becoming who I was now. She was the sort of friend who listened in the way that most people don't bother to, fully, without planning her response while you were still talking. "It's generous," I said, wrapping both hands around my mug. "She's putting in a lot of effort." Sophie looked at me the way she sometimes did, not unkindly, but with a precision I occasionally found uncomfortable. "Clara," she said, "when has Eleanor ever done something generous without it costing you something in return?" I didn't answer that immediately. Outside the coffee shop window, the October light was doing that thing it does, going amber and horizontal, stretching shadows across the pavement. I thought about the lamb with rosemary. I thought about the lemon tart. I thought about 4 years of Sunday dinners and the look on Daniel's face every time his mother walked into a room. "I think she's trying," I said finally. Sophie said, Okay, and sipped her coffee, and did not argue, which was, in retrospect, its own kind of answer. The week before the party, small things began to feel strange. Daniel came home from a Tuesday evening. He'd said he was working late, and I had no reason to doubt this. He worked late regularly, and he was quieter than usual. Not dramatically quiet, not the silence of someone who has something to confess, but the silence of someone who is holding themselves very carefully. He ate dinner without tasting it, scrolled his phone without reading it, and when I asked if everything was all right, he said yes, just tired, and smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. I noticed, but did not press. This was a habit I had developed over 4 years, noticing without pressing, watching without asking. I told myself it was respect for his space. I understand now that it was also, partly, fear. Fear that pressing would surface something I wasn't ready to see. On Thursday, 2 days before the party, Eleanor called to go over the final details. We talked for 20 minutes. She was warm, organized, efficient. She mentioned that Daniel's cousin Robert and his wife were flying in from Boston. She mentioned that she had arranged a special toast sequence, family first, then friends, then a final toast that she herself would deliver. A mother's words, she said, to welcome you properly into the family. I should have heard that. I should have heard the careful construction of it, to welcome you properly, as if 4 years of marriage had been a prolonged audition. But I was happy. I was turning 30, and someone was throwing me a party, and the October light was still coming through the windows of my corner office and turning everything gold. And I let myself be happy. I let my guard down. I had earned it, I thought. I had not. The day of the party, I spent 2 hours getting ready. I wore a dark green silk dress that I had bought specifically for the occasion. Not expensive by any means. I didn't go in for expensive clothes, but it was beautiful, fitted, the color of deep water. My mother, who had flown in from Portland for the occasion, helped me with my hair. She was 61, still sharp-eyed and funny, with the particular warmth of someone who had worked hard her whole life and learned to enjoy small pleasures without guilt. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched me in the mirror and said, "You look like yourself, but more so," which was, I think, the nicest thing anyone had ever said to me about my appearance. We arrived at Meridian at 7:30. The private dining room was exactly as Eleanor had described it. White orchids, candlelight, the low, steady sound of the string quartet playing something I vaguely recognized. 42 people were already seated at long linen-draped tables. I recognized colleagues, friends, Daniel's family, a few people I couldn't immediately place. Everyone turned when I walked in. People smiled, called out, stood up. My colleague Raj raised his glass from across the room. Sophie caught my eye and mouthed, "You look gorgeous." I looked for Daniel. He was standing near the bar with his brother Michael, and when he saw me, something crossed his face. Relief, I thought, or maybe something else. He kissed my cheek and took my hand and said I looked beautiful, and I squeezed his hand back and thought, this is going to be a good night. Eleanor was at the head of the room, speaking with a woman I didn't recognize. She was wearing navy, which suited her. When she saw me, she smiled, that practiced, controlled smile, and came forward to kiss my cheeks and say, "Clara, darling, you look wonderful." And then she looked at my dress and added, almost as an aside, "That green is certainly a choice." And then she moved on. I stood there for exactly 2 seconds, holding that comment in my hands like a small stone, and then I set it down and went to say hello to my mother's oldest friend, who had driven 3 hours to be there, and I did not let it touch me. Or I tried not to. The thing about Eleanor's small cruelties was that they were calibrated for maximum effect with minimum accountability. The raised eyebrow, the slight pause, the certainly a choice. Just sharp enough to sting, just vague enough to deny. Dinner was extraordinary. The food was the kind of food that reminds you why restaurants exist. Not just for sustenance, but for the particular pleasure of something prepared with precision and care. I ate more than I usually did and didn't apologize for it. I talked to everyone, moved between tables, laughed until my face hurt. For 2 hours, the evening was exactly what a 30th birthday should be, warm and full and a little bit overwhelming in the best possible way. And then they started the toasts. The string quartet played a brief interlude while waitstaff refilled glasses, and then Daniel's brother Michael stood and tapped his knife against his glass. He was 3 years older than Daniel, louder, more comfortable in his own skin, and his toast was funny and affectionate and made me laugh genuinely, twice. My mother went next. She kept it short, which was typically unlike her, and I noticed she sat down quickly, as though hurrying to get out of the way. Sophie raised her glass and said something about resilience and intelligence and the particular quality of women who build things with their own hands, and I felt my throat tighten in the good way. Raj from work stood up and made a toast that was half professional accomplishment, half genuine warmth, and mentioned the corner office and the promotion and the fact that in 7 years of working together, he had never once heard me speak badly about anyone, which he said was the most remarkable thing he knew about me, more impressive than the promotion. And then Eleanor stood up. The room settled immediately, the way rooms do when certain people command attention, not through volume, but through some quality of presence that quiets the air around them. She was holding her champagne flute with 2 fingers, lightly, as though it weighed nothing. She looked around the room slowly, the way a speaker does when they are confident of their audience, and then she looked at me. I remember thinking, this is the moment, the welcome, the mother's words. She smiled, and she said, "I want to take a moment to speak honestly, because that's what families do. They speak honestly, even when it's uncomfortable." She paused. The room was very still. I have watched my son Daniel build a life with this woman. I have watched him work to make her happy, to support her career, to accommodate her choices. She paused again. And I feel I owe it to this family, to all of you who have come here tonight to say what I have been thinking for a long time. I was not breathing. I was aware of Sophie's eyes on me from across the table. I was aware of my mother, very still in her chair 2 seats down. I was aware of Daniel, somewhere to my left, and I did not turn to look at him. Eleanor lifted her glass slightly and said, clearly, calmly, in the voice she used for facts, "I'm ashamed we have a daughter-in-law like this in our family." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was not the silence of shock, though there was shock in it. It was the silence of 42 people deciding simultaneously whether to pretend they had misheard. A glass clinked softly somewhere. Someone shifted in their chair. I heard, very clearly, the sound of someone inhaling. I did not move for 4 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. And in those 4 seconds, I felt everything. The flush of humiliation climbing my throat, the cold that followed it, the sudden hyperclarity that comes with extreme emotion, every detail in the room sharpening, the orchids too white, the candlelight too warm, the faces around me frozen in expressions they didn't know how to exit. I felt the silk of my dress against my arms. I felt the weight of the chair beneath me. I felt, most acutely, the absence of Daniel's voice, because he had not said a word. He was sitting 12 inches to my left, and he had said nothing. I stood up. I smoothed my dress. I picked up my champagne flute. I looked directly at Eleanor, and I said, in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness, "Thank you for finally saying out loud what I've been watching you think for 4 years. Now everyone in this room knows exactly who you are." And then I set my glass down, walked to my mother's chair, touched her shoulder, and said quietly, "Get your coat." I went to Sophie and said the same thing. I walked to the exit without looking back. My heels on the marble floor were the only sound in the room. The string quartet had stopped playing. I pushed open the door and the night air hit me, cold and clean and smelling of rain. and I stood on the pavement outside Meridian and breathed. My hands were shaking. I looked at them like they belonged to someone else. My mother came out first, then Sophie, then, after a long minute, Raj, who said nothing but stood beside me with his hands in his pockets in the particular way of someone who understands that presence is sometimes more important than words. My mother put her arm around my shoulders. Sophie said, very quietly, "Well, now we know." Inside, through the tall glass windows of the restaurant, I could see the room. People standing, talking in clusters, the particular energy of an event that has become something other than what it was supposed to be. I could see Eleanor still at the head of the room talking to Pam. I could see Daniel standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the table. He did not come outside. He did not come outside for 22 minutes. I know this because I stood there for 22 minutes in the October cold, in my dark green dress that was certainly a choice, and I waited. Not because I expected him to make it better, but because some part of me needed to know whether he would try, whether he would choose, even once, to stand on the right side of a line he had spent years pretending didn't exist. When he finally came out, he stood in front of me and said, "I'm so sorry, Clara. I didn't know she was going to say that." I looked at him for a long moment. The rain had started, light, the kind that doesn't soak you but makes the air smell of wet stone and possibility. "You didn't know," I said. It was not a question. "No, I swear, I had no idea." I nodded slowly, and I said, "Okay, Daniel." And I meant nothing by it, not forgiveness, not accusation, just, okay, we are going to find out if that's true. I did not sleep that night. I lay in our bed in the apartment with the creaky elevator and listened to the rain move across the city and thought in the particular way you think at 3 a.m, not linearly, but in circles, each loop catching on the same sharp point. You didn't know. He didn't know. The words had a shape I kept running my fingers along, looking for the edge that would tell me whether they were true. Daniel had slept on the couch at his own insistence, which I had not argued with. At some point after midnight, I heard him moving in the living room, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of the kitchen tap, and I pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the ceiling and thought about the Tuesday evening he'd come home quiet. I thought about the Thursday phone call with Eleanor, the careful planning of the toast sequence. Family first, then friends, then a final toast. She had choreographed it. It had not been impulse or wine-loosened carelessness. It had been deliberate, staged, and precisely aimed. But why? That was the question I kept circling back to. Eleanor had never liked me. I had known that for years, accepted it the way you accept unfavorable weather. But this was something different. This was public, targeted, destructive in a way that the usual polished commentary was not. You don't stand up at a woman's 30th birthday party and announce to 42 people that you're ashamed of her without expecting consequences. You don't do that unless you're willing to burn something down, unless you want something burned. I got up at 5:30. The apartment was quiet. Daniel was asleep on the couch with his arm thrown over his eyes, the way he slept when he was uncomfortable. I made coffee, ground the beans quietly, watched the pot, and I stood at the kitchen window and watched the city come awake in the gray October morning, the headlights of early buses, the slow warming of the sky above the buildings to the east. I was thinking about the promotion, about the salary increase, about the fact that 3 weeks after I had received that call, the one that made Daniel spin me around the kitchen until I knocked the colander off the counter, Eleanor had started calling more frequently. I had noticed it and filed it away as coincidence. Now I took it out of the filing cabinet of my memory and looked at it differently. Sophie came over at 9. She arrived with coffee from the place down the street and a look on her face that told me she had not slept much either. Daniel had showered and dressed and was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug, looking like a man awaiting a verdict. Sophie sat across from him. She did not acknowledge him for approximately 40 seconds, which was a specific and surgical kind of statement. "Tell me about the planning," I said to Daniel. "The party. How involved were you?" He looked at me. "What do you mean?" I mean, did you know what she was going to say? Clara, I already told you. I know what you told me. I'm asking you again, in the morning, with coffee, without the adrenaline, did you know? A long pause. He looked at his hands. I didn't know the exact words, he said finally. The room tightened. Sophie set down her coffee very carefully. But you knew something, I said. It was not a question this time either. She mentioned she wanted to say some things about you, to the family. I thought she meant... He stopped. What did you think she meant, Daniel? I thought she meant something about us, about the marriage. I thought it was going to be... You know how she is. I thought it was going to be one of her backhanded... You thought she was going to humiliate me, I said, and you decided not to tell me. The silence that followed was different from the one at the restaurant. That one had been public, performative, witnessed. This one was private and very small and very loud. Daniel's jaw worked. He looked at the table. Sophie looked at me. I didn't think it would be that bad, he said, very quietly. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the October morning was fully arrived now, pale and clean, the wet streets gleaming. A pigeon walked along the edge of the building opposite with absolute certainty of purpose. I watched it until it disappeared around a corner. You need to leave, I said, for tonight. Give me a day. He left without arguing. I will say that for him. He took a bag and left, and when the door clicked shut behind him, Sophie exhaled audibly and said, Right. What do you need? What I needed, I realized as the day wore on, was information. Because the sick feeling in my stomach was not just about the humiliation of the previous evening. It was about the feeling that I was missing the shape of something larger, some structure I had been living inside without knowing its dimensions. Eleanor was not impulsive. The party had not been generosity. The question was, what had it been? I started, methodically, with what I knew. 3 weeks after my promotion, increased phone calls, a party planned with unusual investment of energy and time, a toast sequence with Eleanor last, given the most prominent position, a speech that had clearly been prepared. She had used the word ashamed, which is not a word you choose by accident. It's a word you arrive at deliberately after considering others. And Daniel had known something was coming and had not warned me. I spent the afternoon at my laptop. I went through our shared finances. We had a joint account for household expenses and separate accounts for personal spending, a system we'd set up early in the marriage and never revisited. The joint account looked normal. My personal account looked normal. I checked the mortgage on the apartment. We rented. We had always rented. We had talked vaguely about buying somewhere in the next few years, and it was fine. I checked our investments, small but steady, and they were fine. And then, because I needed to move, to do something with my body while my mind worked, I cleaned the apartment. I cleaned methodically, starting in the kitchen, moving through the living room, the bathroom, and eventually, because I was cleaning everywhere, the small second bedroom we used as a home office. Daniel's desk was there alongside mine. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was cleaning. I was wiping down surfaces and emptying the small trash can beside his desk and straightening the pile of papers on his blotter when I saw it. It was a manila folder, slightly thicker than the others, tucked at the bottom of the pile with the particular casualness of something placed there to not be noticed. I would have left it alone. I genuinely would have, except that on the tab, in handwriting I recognized as Eleanor's, were 3 words: Clara's financial position. I stood there for a long moment with the folder in my hands. The apartment was very quiet. The radiator ticked. Outside, a car alarm started and stopped. I opened the folder. Inside were 7 pages. The first was a summary sheet, handwritten in Eleanor's careful script, laying out my salary, the new salary, the director's salary, the number I had not told anyone except Daniel, my estimated annual bonus, my years at the firm, my projected earnings over the next 10 years. It was not approximate. The numbers were precise, the kind of precise you can only achieve if someone with access to the actual figures has shared them. The second page was a printed spreadsheet, not handwritten, typed and formatted, titled Assets and Liabilities. It listed my assets, my personal savings account with the exact balance, my 401k, a small investment account my father had set up for me when I was 22 and which I had quietly grown over the years. It listed Daniel's assets. It listed our combined household expenses. And then, at the bottom, in a box with a border around it, there was a figure marked, Remaining Transferable Value. Pages 3 and 4 were what I can only describe as research, printouts from legal websites about marital property laws in our state, highlighted passages about the concept of separate property versus marital property, notes in the margin in Eleanor's handwriting, established before marriage, confirm, and inheritance clause, and twice underlined, voluntary transfer. Page 5 was a draft, not a final document, a draft with crossouts and revisions of what appeared to be a financial agreement, a document in which one party, identified only as the wife, which was me, I understood with a cold clarity that seemed to drain the warmth from the room, agreed to establish a family trust to be jointly administered into which a specified percentage of annual income would be deposited. The percentage was 20%. The administrator, named explicitly, was Eleanor. Page 6 was a series of bullet points under the heading Strategy. I will not reproduce them in full because reading them the first time was enough. The relevant points were 1. Establish public perception of wife as emotionally unstable/difficult. 2. Leverage husband's relationship with family to create internal pressure. 3. Identify appropriate moment for formal proposal. 4. Ensure wife is socially isolated before presentation of agreement. Page 7 was a note, handwritten on Eleanor's personal stationery, cream paper with her initials in navy at the top. It was addressed to Daniel. It said, "The event will be the right moment. Afterward, when she is vulnerable, you know what to do." My hands were not shaking. I want you to understand that. I had expected them to shake, the way they had outside the restaurant, but they were completely still. I was standing in the home office of my apartment, holding 7 pages of evidence that my mother-in-law had spent months constructing a strategy to access my finances, and my husband had known, and my hands were perfectly still. I think that stillness was the most frightening thing I have ever felt. It was the stillness of something in me going very, very quiet. Not small, not diminished, but concentrated, the way fire goes quiet right before it catches. I took photographs of every page with my phone. I replaced the folder exactly as I had found it. I walked to the kitchen, poured the remainder of my coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, set it in the rack to dry. And then I picked up my phone and called my father. My father picked up on the second ring, the way he always did, as if he had been waiting specifically for me to call. He was 64, a retired civil attorney, and he had the particular quality of people who have spent decades in the law, a combination of unhurried calm and absolute precision, as though language were a tool to be handled with care. When I told him what I had found, methodically, in order, reading directly from the photographs I had taken, he listened without interruption. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Don't touch anything else," he said. "Don't confront Daniel yet. Don't call Eleanor. I'm coming to you." He was at my apartment by 4 that afternoon, having driven 2 hours from the suburb where he'd lived since my parents' divorce when I was 12. He sat at the kitchen table with the photographs printed on my home printer and his reading glasses on, and went through each page twice with the same careful attention he had once given legal briefs. I made tea. I watched him read. I felt for the first time since the previous evening something that was not quite calm but was adjacent to it, the particular groundedness that comes from having another person in the room who knows what to do. "The draft agreement is interesting," he said finally. "It's not enforceable as written. There are several errors that tell me whoever drafted this is not a family law attorney or is not a good one. but the intent is clear." He took his glasses off and looked at me. "She was planning to present this to you in a moment of vulnerability. The party was designed to create that vulnerability." "I know," I said, "and Daniel knew something was planned, didn't know the exact form it would take, or says he didn't." My father was quiet for a moment. "The note on page 7, you know what to do." "Yes," I said. "That suggests a conversation had already taken place, a specific one." "Yes," I said again. He nodded slowly. "All right, here's what we're going to do." What we were going to do, it turned out, was nothing hasty. This was my father's gift to me, not just legal knowledge, but the understanding that the instinct to act immediately when you are angry is almost always the wrong instinct. We were going to be deliberate. We were going to be precise. We were going to let Eleanor believe, for a few more days, that the party had achieved its intended effect, that I was shaken, isolated, vulnerable. Daniel came back the following evening. He knocked, a detail I noted with a tired kind of appreciation. And when I let him in, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as guilty, in the specific way of someone who has been rehearsing an apology but isn't sure which version to deliver. My father had gone back home. Sophie was at her own apartment, but on call. I was alone with my husband, and I sat across from him, and I waited. "I owe you the truth," he said. "You owe me several truths," I said. "Start anywhere." He started at the beginning, which was 3 months ago, the same week as my promotion. Eleanor had called him. Not an unusual call in itself, but this one had been different. She had asked him, directly, how much I was now earning. He had told her, which was a choice I set aside for the moment to examine later. She had called again the following week, asking about our savings, our investments, our long-term plans. He had answered, more or less. Over the following weeks, she had told him, gradually, with the patience of someone laying tiles one at a time, that she was worried about the family's financial future. That she and Daniel's father had not been as careful with their own finances as they should have been. That there was a shortfall. That she had been thinking about a family arrangement, a trust, a way for everyone to contribute. "And you thought?" I started. "I thought she was asking for help," he said. "Financial help. I thought she was going to ask us for money. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought if I could manage it, if I could keep everyone calm, nobody would have to have a difficult conversation." "So you were going to agree to give her money without telling me?" A long pause. "I was going to talk to you about it." "After." "After what, Daniel?" He looked at the table. "After the party, after she had made her case." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Made her case. As though the plan to publicly humiliate me in front of 42 people on my birthday was a reasonable form of legal argument. As though my vulnerability was a prerequisite for a conversation my husband and his mother had already decided the outcome of. "She told me she was going to say some things at the party," he said, "to make clear that you needed to think about the family, not just your own career. To put you in a position where saying no would be harder." He finally looked up at me. I didn't know she was going to say that. I didn't know she would do it in front of everyone. I thought it would be something private, a conversation. "But you knew she was going to use the party as leverage." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I stood up. I went to the window. The October evening was doing what October evenings do, cooling rapidly, the sky going from pewter to black in the space of a few minutes. I thought about the 22 minutes I had stood outside Meridian in the rain, waiting for him to come outside. I thought about the manila folder tucked under the other papers on his desk. "There's a folder in the office," I said without turning around. "On your desk, a manila folder." A very long silence. "I know," he said. "Did you know what was in it?" "Not everything. She showed me some of it, not all. I didn't know about the draft agreement until—" He stopped again. "Until when?" "Until last week. She showed it to me last week. And I should have. I know I should have told you. I know that." I turned around. He was looking at me with the expression of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, the size of what he has allowed to happen. Not a bad man, not a cruel one, a weak one. A man who had chosen, repeatedly and in small increments, the path of least resistance, which had led him here, sitting at his kitchen table at 9 in the evening, trying to explain to his wife why he had let his mother plan her humiliation. "I need you to understand something," I said. My voice was still steady. It had been steady since the moment I'd found the folder. "I am going to deal with this. I have already spoken to my father. There are going to be consequences for Eleanor, legal ones, because what she attempted is not just unpleasant, it is potentially fraudulent, and it was planned with documented intent to coerce." I paused. "What I have not yet decided is what consequences there are for you." He nodded. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. "You should sleep at home tonight," I said, "but in the office. And tomorrow morning you're going to call your mother and tell her that we need to meet. The three of us. Here." The meeting happened 2 days later, on a Thursday evening at our apartment. I had chosen the apartment deliberately, on my territory, where I controlled the room. Eleanor arrived at 7, punctual as always, and she came in with a composed expression and the faint territorial perfume. She was wearing gray. She sat at the kitchen table across from me, and Daniel sat beside her rather than beside me, which I had expected and did not react to. I opened the meeting by placing the photographs of her folder on the table. All 7 pages, printed clearly. Eleanor looked at them. Her composure held. I had to give her that. She looked at the pages with the expression of someone who has been caught but is not yet prepared to concede the game. "Where did you get these?" "They were on Daniel's desk," I said, "in a folder with my name on it, written in your handwriting." A flicker. Just a flicker. "Those are private family planning documents." "They have my salary on them," I said. "My exact salary, which was shared with you without my knowledge or consent. They have the balance of my personal savings account, which is a private financial account. They have a draft agreement requiring me to transfer 20% of my income to a trust administered by you." I paused. "My father is a retired civil attorney. He has reviewed these documents. He has also been in contact with a family law specialist who believes there is a case for attempted financial coercion." The composure cracked. Not dramatically. Eleanor was too controlled for drama. But it shifted. A slight tightening around the eyes. A barely perceptible adjustment of posture. "Clara, I think you're being—" "I want you to hear me very clearly," I said, still in the same level tone I had been using since Daniel first came back to the apartment. "I am not going to sign anything. I am not going to agree to any arrangement involving my income or my assets. I am not going to be vulnerable for your benefit or anyone else's." I paused again. "And I am not, under any circumstances, going to pretend that what you said at my birthday party was anything other than what it was." Silence. "She's being dramatic," Eleanor said, turning to Daniel. "This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. She's emotional. She can't see—" "Mom," Daniel said. His voice was quiet. "Stop." I looked at him. It was the first time in 4 years that I had heard him use that tone with her. Flat, definitive. The tone of someone who has made a decision and intends to hold it. Eleanor looked at him too, and her face changed. The flash of something raw passing through the composed surface, something that looked almost like fear. "Daniel, stop," he said again. "Clara is right. And I should have said that 3 months ago, when you first brought me this plan. I should have told you no, and I should have told her everything. I didn't, and that's on me. But I'm telling you now, this is over. Whatever you were trying to do, it's over." The silence that followed was very long. Eleanor sat perfectly still, and I watched her. The controlled posture, the impeccable chignon, the perfume still faintly discernible even across the table, and I felt something I had not expected, Not triumph exactly, but something clearer. Recognition. I was finally seeing the full shape of it, the architecture of the thing she had built over years, the small comments, the carefully placed slights, the cultivation of Daniel's guilt and obligation, and seeing it clearly made it smaller. It was formidable, but it was not infinite. It had edges, and now I knew where they were. "There will be a written apology," I said, "addressed to me and to the people who were at that party, your son's family, my mother, my colleagues. I am not interested in broadcasting your failures. I am interested in acknowledging mine, specifically the failure to have addressed this clearly and years ago. Your apology should address what you said at the party and the circumstances under which you said it." I folded my hands on the table. "My father will draft the parameters. You have 2 weeks." Eleanor stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at me with an expression I will not easily forget. Not rage, not contempt, but something that was perhaps its closest neighbor, a deep, controlled outrage at being seen, at having the architecture exposed. She left without saying another word. The door clicked shut. Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and listened to the sound of the elevator, creaking, as always, carrying her down. 4 months passed. Eleanor sent the apology, 3 weeks after our meeting, not 2, drafted in language that was precisely calibrated to acknowledge wrongdoing without fully owning it. My father reviewed it and advised me to accept it, which I did. Daniel and I began what I can only describe as the long, difficult, uncertain work of figuring out whether a marriage can survive a specific kind of failure. Not infidelity, not cruelty, but the failure of a man to protect the person he had promised to protect. And the question of whether that failure was a deviation or a pattern. I am still working on that. I want to be honest about that. I do not have a clean resolution to offer you. Daniel and I are still married. We are also still, in some fundamental way, deciding what that means. We are in therapy, which is not cinematic, but is useful. The therapist has a ficus in the corner of her office that I have watched over many sessions put out 3 new leaves. Eleanor and I do not spend time together. This was a boundary I drew clearly, and Daniel, to his credit, has not pushed back on. She has not been to our apartment. We have not attended family dinners. There will be a time, perhaps, when this changes, when the architecture of something new can be built on the cleared ground of the old. But that time is not now, and I am not rushing toward it. What I have, in the meantime, is my corner office on the 14th floor. I have the 20 minutes each morning when the light comes in at an angle and turns everything gold. I have Sophie, who takes me to coffee and listens fully, and does not plan her response while I'm still talking. I have my mother, who told me on the phone last week that she was proud of me, in a way that was so direct and undecorated that it made me cry on the subway, which I have made peace with. I have the folder. My father has the originals. They are evidence, and they are also something else. They are the record of someone who underestimated me so thoroughly that she put the underestimation in writing. I think about that sometimes. I think about the word remaining transferable value, how it was the way she saw me, as a resource to be extracted, a number on a page. And I think about how wrong she was, how entirely, profoundly, irreversibly wrong. I am 30 years old. I have a corner office and a ficus putting out new leaves, and a marriage I am still deciding the shape of, and a sentence I said at my own birthday party that made 42 people put down their champagne glasses and stare. I do not have uncomplicated happiness, or certainty, or the comfortable life I thought I was walking into on that October evening in my dark green dress. But I have something better, I think. I have clarity. I have the knowledge, earned the hard way, of exactly where I stand, and who is standing beside me, and who, finally, at last, with my own 2 eyes fully open, is not. Some women spend their whole lives learning that lesson in the soft way, in small increments, never quite naming it. I learned mine in one sentence, at a table covered in white orchids with 42 witnesses. I'm ashamed we have a daughter-in-law like this in our family. So am I, Eleanor. So am I.